Hello, everyone, and welcome back to California Ocean Science Trust's 2026 Sea Change Scholars webinar series called Navigating Your Future, Careers at the Ocean and Coastal Science Policy Nexus. My name is Heidi Waite, and I am a science officer at OST, whose mission is to really strengthen this connection between scientific research and sound ocean management. Part of meeting that mission includes making investments to support graduate education and ultimately California's science capacity. This webinar series is made to give students a window into the real-world ocean and coastal related careers at the science policy interface in California. Be sure to check out our website. We have several resources there, including a companion journal for the series and recordings of previous panel discussions, and a 30-minute overview of California state entities at that ocean science policy nexus. Moving forward, we will continue featuring staff to discuss their careers and the roles they play at the state's science policy and management landscape. And today we're really excited to have staff from the California State Lands Commission, whose mission is to provide the people of California with effective stewardship of lands, waterways, and resources entrusted to its care based on the principles of equity, sustainability, resiliency, through preservation, restoration, enhancement, responsible economic development, and the promotion of public access. So we're really excited to have our panelists today to give us an insight into their roles and career pathways and what exactly it means to work with the California State Lands Commission. I'll start with some introductions of the panelists, then we'll dig into the questions. We have some prepared for the panelists today and have incorporated some of those we've gotten through the registration process, and we'll sprinkle in questions that come through the live Q&A, which is at the bottom of your Zoom frame that you can use to submit any questions you have as they pop into your mind throughout today's discussion. So with that, I would like to invite panelists one at a time to turn on their camera and give us a brief introduction. So I'll start with Katie. You're up next. If will join me and give your quick introduction, including name, pronouns, and title. I'll pass it to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Heidi. Hello, everyone. My name is Katie Robinson-Filipp. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior environmental scientist at the California State Lands Commission on our Climate Adaptation and Special Initiatives team.
Great. Thank you so much. Next up is Lina. Thank you for joining us. Can you also give us a brief intro with your name, pronouns, and current job position?
Hi, yes, thank you for inviting me. My name is Lina Ceballos. I'm a senior environmental scientist with the Marine Invasive Species Program for the State Lands Commission. And yeah, you will hear a little bit more of what we do later.
Yes, thank you. All right, last but not least, Chris, please join us and give us your intro.
Thanks, Heidi. So my name is Chris Scianni. Use he, his pronouns, and I'm the Environmental Program Manager for the Marine Invasive Species Program, also,
Amazing.
along with
Yes.
Lina.
Great. Well, before we dig into exactly what those titles and roles mean, I'm hoping we can circle back to Katie right now. I personally didn't always really think of state lands as super connected and oceans and coasts, excuse me. So I'm wondering, Katie, if you could give us sort of a high-level overview of the mission, the role, and sort of the divisions within State Lands Commission that are related to coasts and oceans.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we're a bit of an obscure agency, but we actually have an important role in a lot of ocean and coastal management decisions and projects and related activities. So the State Lands Commission is essentially responsible for managing public trust lands, which are the state's sovereign lands. These lands occur from the mean high tide line to 3 miles offshore. It also includes tidally influenced waters, including bays, estuaries, as well as the beds of naturally navigable waterways and lakes. And so we have a pretty kind of broad jurisdictional oversight over a wide variety of ocean and coastal habitats. We also have some terrestrial lands, but I'll focus on the oceans and coasts for today. Within the commission, we have a few different divisions, and we all work together to enact the mission that Heidi, talked about earlier. But essentially, we have what is our land management division, and this is the division that's responsible for reviewing lease applications and doing a lot of work on monitoring interest for activities and uses that come through to us for leases. And then we have the division that Chris, Lina, and I work in, which is the Division of Environmental Science Planning and Management. We call that DESPM. And within this division, we have several teams, and we each work on different aspects of ocean and coastal management. We have our SIMS team, which is our CEQA implementation and management unit, and this team is responsible for environmental review of projects and activities that come through either through CEQA work or through lease applications. And so this team is responsible for reviewing the potential environmental impacts of various activities. They also do a lot of work on some of our decommissioning activities. So, for example, oil and gas platforms within state waters. There is a lot of work going on right now to figure out how to responsibly decommission these platforms and ensure safety. And so that's a lot of the work that they do. And then we also have our MIST program, which is our Marine Invasive Species program, which I'm sure Lina and Chris will talk a little bit more about, but they're responsible for implementing the Marine Invasive Species Act. And then we have the Climate Adaptation and Special Initiatives team that I work with. We're responsible for doing a lot of our interagency work with partners across the state, at the state level, local and regional levels as well. And we do a lot of work on, informing state policy, on coastal adaptation. We also do a lot of work on assessing climate impacts and climate risks associated with lease applications or other projects within our ocean and coastal lands that we manage. So that's kind of a broad overview. And yeah, thanks.
Amazing. Thank you, Katie. That's very helpful to know. And it seems like, a diverse amount and different kinds of work being done at state land. So thank you for that overview. I'm wondering now, we've heard your titles, so maybe we can dig into a little bit what that means and what kind of work you all do. And Katie, you gave a little bit already about yours, but I'll circle to you at the end here. Maybe I'll start with Chris, if you wouldn't mind giving us sort of a brief overview of what your position title means, how long you've been there, and maybe the highlights of your journey to get there.
Sure. Yeah. So again, I'm the environmental program manager for the Marine Invasive Species program, and our program regulates commercial ships. So we the primary way that invasive species come into California's coastal environment and coastal environments all over the world is through commercial shipping. And so the legislature tasked us with regulating commercial ships for ballast water and biofouling, and we can get into some descriptions of what those are. But we develop policy, we implement the policy, and we enforce those policies. My role in the program is kind of overseeing we talk about what we do within the California State Lands Commission, but our Marine Invasive Species program really spans four different departments. So there's a part of our program in the Department of Fish and Wildlife, a part in the State Water Resources Control Board, and a part in the Department of Tax and Fee Administration. And so there's a lot of collaboration that goes on between all four departments under the umbrella of this program. So working with partners in those agencies, working with the different parts of our team here at the State Lands Commission. So we have a science policy team, we have a data management team, we have inspectors that go on board ships to go and do the inspections. So working between all of these different groups is how I spend a lot of my days. I've been with the program and the commission for almost 19 years now. I started as an environmental scientist. I then became a staff environmental scientist, which was the precursor to senior environmental scientist, which we didn't have back then. And about 10 years ago, took a senior environmental scientist supervisory position here in Long Beach. So I moved to Long Beach from Sacramento. And for the last 5 years, I've been the environmental program manager.
Great, that's helpful. And it's really interesting to hear what that progression looks like within different state agencies and the different title names. So appreciate that. Maybe Lina, you could give a little bit of background on what you do specifically within that same program.
Sure. Yeah, so following up with what Chris was saying, I'm a senior environmental scientist for the Marine Invasive Species Program, and I have been with the program for about 8 years now. And what I do more specifically related to regulating this shipping industry is we collect a lot of data from the ships. Every time that they come to California, they need to submit different forms that tell us all their operating procedures and how they're gonna manage the invasive species. So a lot of my work is dealing with that data and playing with it, analyzing, looking at patterns, and then using those patterns to inform future regulations. I also do a lot of outreach within California, with working with multiple agencies, but also internationally, we work with the shipping industry is an international industry, right? So we work very closely with a lot of countries like New Zealand, Australia, and like we have been doing a lot of work in Latin America, um, sharing expertise and data and collaborating in different levels.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really interesting and cool to hear that you get the chance to also collaborate internationally. Um, Katie, I know that you explained sort of what your division ha does, but curious to know what you do specifically within that and how long you've been with in that position and what kind of highlights from your career path.
Thank you. Yeah, I started the commission in 2019 as a California Sea Grant Fellow. So, for those who aren't familiar, the California Sea Grant Fellowship Program is for recent graduate students. So, I was placed with the State Lands Commission, primarily working on the implementation of our environmental justice policy, which the commission had just adopted. Since being a fellow, I've now transitioned as an environmental scientist with the commission, and then later transitioned as a senior environmental scientist. I've continued working on our environmental justice policy with our environmental justice liaison. However, most of my day-to-day activity is spent working on interagency priorities and policies related to climate adaptation and environmental conservation and preservation. So I lead the Commission's work on 30 by 30, which is a statewide initiative. It's a statewide goal for protecting and conserving 30% of the state's lands and coastal waters by 2030. And so I work on assessing which of our lands meet 30 by 30 criteria. I also work on a lot of climate adaptation work. So currently I'm working on a project within the Bay Area to develop guiding principles to help inform responsible and sustainable waterfront development projects. And so this involves working with a lot of our local partners and trustees on understanding what their needs and values are. So I do a lot of engagement and kind of outreach-based work. And then I also do a lot of work on kind of our statewide priorities like the climate adaptation strategy. So one, contributing which actions and commitments the commission can make within that strategy, and then also figuring out how to kind of bring those internal and figure out how to integrate them into the work that all of our divisions do within the commission.
Amazing. That's helpful to hear about your journey as well. Kind of a question around reflecting on this career journey. In some cases, within state lands, there's maybe the hierarchy pathway, but just wondering if you've had any thoughts on how closely your path aligned to what you originally were expecting, maybe in grad school. Do you think you were going to end up here? What are kind of the thoughts there? And if you did transition, what did that transition look like, or how did you feel about that transition? And it's a large question, but maybe pass, Katie, you just spoke, so maybe Lina, I know you've transitioned from maybe this research side of things. So yeah, how closely did this align with what you were thinking and what you're doing now?
Yeah, I guess it was never in my plans when I was in grad school to end up in the policy world because I was doing a lot of research and enjoying a lot that part of my career, the research side of things. However, I did my master's in San Francisco State, and then I started working right after with Smithsonian Institution, and they have an invasive species lab. And through that position, I met a lot of people, including Chris, that was working already in the policy world in the same topic that I was doing research on, which was invasive species. So I started kind of doing that type of network and connection with the policy world since I was in the research side of things. So when the opportunity presented to move into a state position in doing more applied policy and not that much hands-on biology, it was a little bit of a hard decision, but it was also a very exciting part for me to kind of learn more about that world. But yes, it was not in my plans, but I think it was a good decision. It feels like the policy for me is a little more applied. Well, when you're doing research specifically, like really into the weeds of the research, just looking at creatures in the microscope, you kind of forget the big picture. So this feels a little more applied.
Right, definitely. That's something I felt in grad school too. And when I after grad school was thinking what kind of further along that pipeline of science into action. Into so the policy space feels a little bit more like that space to make more impact and bring that science to decision making. Maybe, Katie, I might follow up with you actually on the similar question on that transition and how is it what you expected, but transition from that research role into policy management world? Yeah, what are your thoughts and reflections on that process?
Yeah, so I during my master's program, I was busy knee deep in mud, looking for what is the best California fish, the California killifish. Spending hours in the lab, and I really enjoyed that work. I enjoyed, getting out in the field, and I still enjoy getting out in the field. But one thing that I was really trying to figure out is, what is this nexus and intersection between science, policy, and community? And so I had an opportunity to do an internship through the NSF program with the city of San Diego, working on their climate action plan. And it was just really incredible to work on something that was tangible and that had an impact to the community. And was also still relevant to my research interests and to the topics that I feel passionate about. And so I started to explore other opportunities to dive deeper into policy to see if this was a path that I wanted to continue on. And so I had the opportunity to work with State Lands Commission as a Sea Grant Fellow. And it was just a really incredible introduction to kind of, the state of policy within California, and having the opportunity to work on, the environmental justice policy. I really had such a firsthand experience of being able to work within that nexus of, working with communities, working on, informing policy that is meaningful and impactful and relevant to communities that also integrates best available science. And so it was just this really great opportunity. And I think, as I've continued down this path, I've just really appreciated the different roles I've been able to play in, trying to continue to elevate, the best available science and ensure that we are making, responsible decisions that not only are beneficial to, the people of California today, but also have an impact on generations for tomorrow. And so I will say it's probably been, in terms of kind of my expectations, I think it's been something that, I wasn't initially anticipating enjoying it so much. And I've really had just such a positive experience on kind of going down this route. And yeah.
Great. So that's great to hear. Appreciate those reflections. Now, Chris, similar question or welcome your thoughts on that question and maybe adding to it also on if there's any kind of skill within grad school that helped with that transition or in your position now is really useful.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. When I was in grad school, I was a biological oceanographer, and I was all about the research, and I was spending every day, obviously, out in the field, a lot of days doing experiments in the lab, and it. I wasn't envisioning being 100% in policy 20 years later. So it was a difficult transition, kind of what you've been hearing, that it was tough going from being in hands deep in science to then go into policy. And for me, when I first started, we were it was early in our program's history. The legislature tasked us with new things, and right away when I started, they asked us to develop biofouling management regulations for these ships. And this was done nowhere else in the world. So it was no template to work off of. Let's do this new regulation idea. And by the way, there's a lot of data gaps, so take some time and fill in those research gaps. And so the legislature gave us that leeway. And so we started hiring different groups to do some of this work for us, and then they produced reports for us, and then we're turning that into policy and thinking about how we can turn that into policy. And it was interesting, but it wasn't as satisfying as I wanted. And so at a time, so when I was in graduate school, I took science diving, research diving as one of my courses. And because I was in the biological oceanography lab, my advisor at the time said, that's not really going to be beneficial to you as a biological oceanographer. I recommend you don't take this class. You should be focusing on doing your research. And I didn't take that advice. I still went and did that. And I'm very thankful that I did, because in this position, a lot of the work that we were farming out to other research groups was to do research diving on ships to look at patterns of what's growing on the bottoms of their hulls and trying to understand why that's happening and how we can prevent that. And so I talked with my manager at the time about, like, we're having these groups, we're spending money on these groups to do this. Could we save a little bit more money if I join the research myself and provide in-kind service to this? And there wasn't a mechanism in place for that because we're a small agency. We don't have a dive program. We don't have a dive safety officer. And so their initial answer was, no, I don't think we could do this, but let's see if we can make it work. And so working with my manager, I worked with the Smithsonian group that Lina came from, talked with their dive safety officer, talked with my dive safety officer at graduate school, figured out how to get the reciprocity to go across three different entities, figuring out how the state without a dive program could do the insurance and liability protection that was necessary for that sort of arrangement. And then it ended up working, and I was able to go and do that research. Spend that really satisfied the desire I had to continue doing research, and so it made that transition really nice. And so we've continued to do that. We've been able to do that, have good collaborations. And when the time came to help recruit Lina to our team, that's an added benefit. So I would say, like, that was an unexpected skill that I developed in graduate school that I was able to use here and help improve our program over time. But I think the expected skill, a good skill that I developed was just collaboration. And that's you've heard that from Katie and from Lena, that we do a lot of collaboration with other agencies in the state, with other states, especially us with our shipping industry that trades globally. We do have to interact every day with folks in other states at the federal level and in different countries. And so in graduate school, I did a lot of, because I was doing research diving and doing my own research. So I'll back up a little bit. I went to Moss Landing Marine Labs in the Monterey Bay area, and it's a consortium of California State University campuses that provide marine science students to go to this marine lab. And it's a very small school. There are about 60 of us, and a lot of us didn't have funding for our research, so we ended up asking our friends and our roommates, can you come and help me with my research? I'll go help you with yours. And so through that sort of process over time, I developed a lot of interesting skills and skill sets and research that wasn't my own, but I think that helped for me to develop the collaboration across different labs within the marine laboratories where we were. And so I think we use that every day here, the collaboration, and it's so important to what we do to make sure that we're effective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fun to hear how you've created some opportunity in the diving world and also building out these collaborations. And it's something maybe in grad school you don't really realize you're building some of these skills and transferable skills. So something to keep in mind, folks in the audience, that you're learning a lot more and building a lot more skills than you might think. Which maybe I actually will jump down to a question around that for Lina and Katie to also maybe weigh in on what kind of skills you've brought from grad school or otherwise that you think are really helpful in being in your position now and yeah, how to think about that while you're in grad school and building some things that could be useful in the future.
Sure. Definitely backing up what Chris was saying, collaboration, talk to the people, trying to be at the right place at the right moment, go to conferences, go to meetings, ask questions, learn about, try to learn things that even if you think they're not going to be useful or you're not super into it, maybe one day that will come up. Um, will be helpful. One strength for me, it was, I think, data analysis. I did a lot of that when I was doing my research. I started teaching myself how to do a little bit of coding and using R and yeah, stats and all that. That even though it wasn't my favorite part of doing research, I did gain a lot of skills that I have been using in this position quite a lot.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And maybe Katie, feel free to weigh in on that. And I'm also curious, I think you mentioned at one point about yeah, the research into policy and how things are a little bit different as a scientist going into policy. So if there's skills related to that or just generally um, any yeah, any feedback on that.
Yeah, I think, one thing that you kind of quickly learn when you're involved in research is that it's really important to be able to pivot and be adaptable. You never know when there's going to be a challenge, whether you're out in the field and maybe, your netting or something breaks and you have to on the fly figure out how you're going to fix it. It's very similar to policy as well. So, each of our teams, we're pretty small and we have to be nimble. Obviously we have our kind of day-to-day tasks, but we are, also we have a, set of commissioners, and one of our commissioners may hear from a member of the public about a challenge or a concern, and they bring it to us and say, what is our response to this? Like, what are we doing? What can we do? And right then you have to be able to pivot from what you're doing. You have to be able to assess your priorities, and you have to, we say this often at the commission, but being a generalist who is able to specialize, which is something that you kind of do when you start out at research, right? You kind of look at this general question and you have to be able to, dive in and dig deep. And that's been a really useful skill. And it's something that, comes up often, almost, kind of on a day-to-day basis, pretty much working for, a small agency. We don't have, experts that we can just call on the fly. So oftentimes we have to be able to dive in and familiarize ourselves with the challenge and with the questions and kind of the landscape of the situation and figure out, what is our role here? What can we do? What have we done? And so I think that's a helpful skill and something that, I wasn't really anticipating was being relatable to the job that we do. But yeah, definitely being able to pivot, be adaptable, and dive in.
Yeah, that's certainly something, at least on the diving in on new topics and getting up to speed quickly that you do in grad school. So it's something that continues to be a useful skill moving forward. That's good to hear. Um, Maybe we can transition to a question because we have a group here that's more senior staff and senior environmental scientists and manager positions. I'm curious, and maybe I'll direct this to Chris to start with and see if others have to include to hear a little bit about what kind of things you've done to best for your success, essentially. Like, what are the some actions, building of relationships, or maybe tips on and tools used to help you move through your career advancement? I think Chris, you mentioned at one point IDPs, so I would love to hear a little bit how you were able to use that and maybe your manager relationship and building this dive program. So curious what yeah, what has best set you up
Yeah.
for success in your career so far?
Yeah, I think it's the planning. So the IDP is an individual development plan, and it's an optional thing that we can do at the state to identify goals that you might have for yourself in the near future or medium future, and then come up with a plan for how you're going to achieve that goal or put yourself in a good position to achieve it. So I think for me early on, well, one thing that is useful for the state system, especially with environmental scientists classifications, is there's a series and it goes from three different ranges of environmental scientists to a senior environmental scientist, senior environmental scientist supervisor, environmental program manager, and each one of those steps are related to each other, but there are different knowledge, skills, and abilities is what we call them, tied to each of those that makes you eligible for a position for that type of position. And so what I've done throughout my career here is keep an eye towards what are those knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required for the next level above where I'm at, and work with my manager to develop an individual development plan to help get me the experience to then be qualified for that next level once I have the appropriate number of years in state service. And that could be taking training, it could be um, prioritizing time out in the field doing research or doing rulemaking, regulation development, that we do a lot of that within our program. And so taking specific training for that and then going through the process of either leading a rulemaking or assisting with somebody else that's leading a rulemaking. When I first started, that was pretty overwhelming for me because like I said before, I came in from a research-based graduate program, and a month after I was hired, we got the that directive from the legislature to develop these biofiling regulations, and then that fell on my lap. And so I had to quickly learn how to do a regulation development, and then quickly figure out what types of research we needed to do to make sure we're filling the appropriate gaps, and then go through the whole process of doing the regulation development and adoption. So those sorts of things you can spell out in an IDP and make sure that you're always looking at what you can do next year or the year after to make sure you're putting yourself in a good position for when a position opens up.
Great. And that kind of makes me think of the process of applying for some of the state and knowing what those different levels are and what you're best positioned for applying to. So maybe I'll pass to Katie first, but touching on that process of the state positions and that could be very tricky to do. So curious if you have any if you can share any insights on the application process, sort of how to write those, any tips, make sure you're making sure you're hired at the correct level, how to hit on keywords, maybe what does that look like, and what kind of things did you learn through your process of applying?
Yeah, thank you. I think when I first began applying for state jobs, it's helpful that I was a fellow. And so I was able to, ask my manager for advice about, how to navigate this process. But it can be a pretty intimidating process when you first kind of approach how to apply to a state job. So first, you have to typically take an exam for the classification that you're going for. And so as Chris mentioned, the environmental scientist series, you have an exam for the environmental scientist, and then there's also an exam for senior environmental scientist, and so on. And so one thing, it's very technical. You have to look at what are the, classification requirements to take the exam, and you have to make sure that you meet those. There's typically, an educational requirement or experience a requirement, and then these are typically like self-assessments. And so you rate yourself on, how much experience do you have with data analysis, or how much experience you have with, creating, technical documents. And so you basically, take this exam, and then you're ready to apply to positions. And I think one thing that was really surprising to me is, you really want to tailor your resume and your application materials to, hit various kind of like checkboxes or keywords that are presented in the application or the position. So typically you'll see a position and it will have desirable qualifications. And so you need to make sure that you integrate those into your application materials while also making sure that you hit the minimum qualifications that are required by that classification. And so there are a couple of different components to it. And so I think, really the best tip or advice that I can provide is, just make sure to take the time to review your application and make sure that you are reflecting your experience in a way that aligns with the desirable qualifications for the position, and that is also reflecting that you meet the minimal qualifications for this class. So it can be a little tricky to start, but there's a really great, there are a lot of great resources online as well. And California Natural Resources Agency also has a career center. And that is a really great resource where you can also go and kind of help get advice and additional tips as well.
That's really helpful. I don't know if Lina, Chris, if you had any thoughts to weigh in on this question on applying for state positions and maybe getting hired at the right level. I know potentially, Chris, you had some experience at renegotiating that when you first getting hired on.
Sure, I'll jump in. Yeah, Katie is 100% correct. Yeah, you definitely have to make sure that you're reading the job description and the class specification and make sure that your application materials match that. So my example is I filled out my application when I was coming out of grad school, and I got hired on as an environmental scientist at the first range. And I I felt like I should have been at that higher range, the second or third range level within that range. And I didn't really say anything about it until about a year later. And I did have a lot of experience doing similar work while I was in graduate school, both at my school and at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute that I worked at the same time. So I did a lot of things that I felt would have carried over. And when I talked to our HR about it, what came out of that discussion was that the way that I presented my prior work history in my resume and in the application wasn't didn't match what they were looking for equivalency for environmental science work. While it was, the way I described it didn't display that. So they had me redo my application material, and they decided that yes, I did have the equivalency to be hired at the higher range within the environmental scientist classification. So I think it was just an important eye opener for me that you think you're putting together this package that is reflective of the work you've done, but you need to be very careful about making sure that it matches what the hiring agency is looking for. And a lot of times the people that are doing this initial review don't have a science background, and it's harder for them to match A to A when the words don't match. So make sure that you're looking at what that description is and adjust accordingly.
That's a good point about not the folks reading your application are not always scientists, so making sure that it's understood by that group also and that matches up with their kind of HR classifications is important. Lina, did you have any thoughts to add here?
I guess the only thing that I will add, and this is, I understand it's not always possible, but if you have the chance to meet and talk to the people at either the current position or a similar position or someone in the team that you want to join, they will give you more insights of what they're looking for, and you can kind of prepare your application and your interview and everything based on that, which was a little bit of my case because I knew already a lot of the people in this group. So we had worked together, we had collaborated before. So I think that that helped a lot.
Hmm. It sounds like you've already had some relationships built with the folks that you were going to be working with in your current position. But as a follow-on, was there anything about the position that you wish you had known before taking, or that was very different or surprising about the position when you joined?
Um, I guess it was not surprising. I just didn't think about it that much. But when you're a scientist, you like results, you see the results, and you know what you're supposed to do and to recommend what's good for the environment. And like it's a very um, kind of results-based response. However, in the policy world, that's completely different because as a scientist, you tell them, hey, you should do this to the regulated industry, the shipping industry in my case. They say, well, that's not going to work for us. So you kind of need to understand that it's not always as you would like to be, and you need to learn how to negotiate and kind of meet people in the middle. You're dealing, again, in my case, we're dealing with a very strong and powerful industry, which is the shipping industry. And we cannot just tell them, hey, you cannot discharge ballast water ever again because you bring invasive species. Obviously, that's not possible for many reasons. So you need to learn negotiating skills and understanding that it's not all around science. There is other and many other factors involved that you need to start learning how to balance out. And that's a skill and that I never thought I will need that much in this position. Another one that just came to my mind very quickly is, and this doesn't apply to everyone, but as a woman working in a fully male dominated industry, that has been a little bit of a challenge and a surprise. Like I avoid trying to board vessels by myself because the whole crew are males and it feels a little intimidating. So that walking through that male dominated industry has been a little bit of a challenge and unexpected unexpected challenge, I will say.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. And it is something I certainly have experienced too on the portion about learning maybe kind of diplomacy skills, negotiation, understanding the smaller, social cues, etc., and understanding of the positionality of different groups that you're talking to is really important and something that comes with experience, I think, being in the space, but maybe is something um, that is less thought of when you're applying for positions in this field, which kind of is one of those transition skills. And we have an audience question on general career transition. So if you all don't mind, maybe we can ask this question, get an answer to this question around career transitions. Let me see if, sorry, pulling it up. Okay, so on state applications, they generally call for STD 678 form, resume statement of qualifications. So on the hiring, from a hiring perspective, given some of you have probably been involved in this hiring process, how do you distinguish between the various documents in assessing an applicant's qualifications? And I don't know if anyone wants to take first stab at that.
Sure, I will, if you don't mind. Yeah, so oftentimes when you're hiring for a position, there's the standard 678, right? There's the application, and depending on the hiring manager or the HR policy, there might also be a statement of qualifications or other questions that are included to help with that process. I would say that they're all important. Um, what usually happens before the call for a position even goes out, the hiring manager has to come up with a scoring metric for how they're going to score each part of the resume. I'm sorry, each part of the application, each part of the supplemental questionnaire, or whatever other additional documents are required. So every single one of those is assessed against a prearranged scoring rubric. So you do want to touch on every single question or every single piece of information that is requested. And again, to what we've been saying, to tie that back into the job description, the class specification, because that's usually what the scores are based on. So prior to even seeing someone's answers, you're going to say, if they're addressing this issue, in a high, medium, or low, they're going to get 1, 2, or 3 points. And so just making sure that you're touching on every single item that's requested and tying that back to the position description is important.
That's helpful to get the behind the scenes of how the manager kind of structures their evaluation of these applications. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and
Go for
I'll
it.
just say that's it's important because we need to be uh, fair across the board, right? If we get 100 applications for a single position, it's hard to review all of those and maintain that fair level of review. And so doing it this way with that scoring rubric, it does help maintain that consistency across all of the applications.
Absolutely. Kate or Lena, anything to add?
I would probably just add one thing. I've only had the opportunity to participate once in a hiring process, but I think one thing that really popped out to me was, just kind of connecting back to kind of this larger role that AI is starting to play. When you use AI for your application materials, like just be very careful. Um, Typically with the supplemental questions, these questions are kind of asking about, kind of broad topical areas about, your project management experience. And I can't tell you how many of supplemental questions I've read that were almost word for word the same because they use like generative AI without tailoring it to like their specific experience. And so, just be very careful because you want to make sure that you are creating a reflection of the work that you do. And if you have 100 applications to review, and 40 of them are almost word for word the same, you're not going to stand out. And so just take a mindful approach to applying to positions, and make sure that you are really reflecting your experience and the work that you've done through your application materials, and just kind of tying it back to the position itself.
That's great advice, I think. Thank you for that. I think given our looking at the time, I think I might circle us back a little bit to current, sort of your current roles and what that entails. And you've given us sort of a background on a brief overview of what your job is. But I am interested, as always, on what was something you love doing or a favorite bit that you've gotten to do with this current position and or a previous position along the way. Um, and if there is anything that you find challenging or maybe the least glamorous kind of aspect of your job, would also like to hear that. So, your favorite and your more challenging kind of um, roles within your position. And maybe Lena, I could start with you.
Sure. There are a lot of things that I like doing, and my job varies a lot too, but definitely boarding vessels and learning a lot about how the vessels work and all this process. It's just a whole new world once you step in a vessel and go down to the engine room and try to understand a little bit the processes, the treatment systems, and um, dealing with the crews and the different nationalities of these crews and the protocols. That has been fascinating. So a lot of the time, well, not a lot of the times, but sometimes I get to board vessels to collect ballast water samples. So you need to learn a lot how to communicate and move inside a vessel and uh, a lot of things that I never thought I would do. Even though in my previous job, I was doing some diving under the vessels, so I got a little bit of a glimpse of that. It's just a very interesting world that not a lot of people gets to experience. Um, and then the less glamorous, I don't know, I don't get to do a lot of hands-on biology these days. I did a lot of less glamorous work before.
Some of that grunt work in the lab or yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Great, thank you. I appreciate that reflection. Maybe Chris next, if you want to answer a similar question about your favorite thing or your the least glamorous bit of the position.
Yeah, I'll say my favorite things are I talked earlier about how we used to hire the different science group to do the work for us, and now that we're doing a lot of collaborating. We do get to publish a lot now. That was pretty much not a thing when I first started with our program, and over the past almost 10 years now, we've been pretty prolific at publishing through collaborations with different groups all across the world. So that's been fantastic. And I guess on that topic too, the because we're collaborating with these groups in different parts of the world, and because we're regulating the sh international shipping industry, and because we were on the cutting edge of some of these types of regulations and implementing these types of regulations, we've had the opportunity to travel a lot to a lot of different countries to share data, share our experiences. And so both Lena and I have been able to travel to a lot of different countries over the past, at least for me, over the past 15 years, all over. So it's been great. I really appreciate that and the collaboration that we've been able to build with these different groups that are all thinking the same thing, and now we're able to learn from each other rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. So it's been great. Least glamorous probably is, and I'm saying this because it's freshest in my mind because we just passed through March, but part of my role is to do performance appraisals, and we do them all during the month of March, and our team is 10 people, and so that means doing a bunch of these during March. It's least glamorous because of the time involved in preparing it, and it does take a lot of time if you're doing it correctly to really thoughtfully put down what the description of someone's performance. It's not glamorous, but it also is rewarding because it forces me to reflect on the good work that people are doing throughout the year. So it's kind of a both answer. It's not glamorous, but it is rewarding.
Right. Yes, I agreed and skipped my question and gave me an answer that's both least glamorous and rewarding. Love that. Katie, do you want to weigh on that one? And then I have one final question for you all.
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the most exciting parts of my role, or at least one of the things that brings me the most joy through my work, is working with our state, local, regional partners, working with tribal governments, working with community-based organizations. I really like the engagement component of the work that I do. So being able to, work with people, understand, what are their priorities, what are their needs, what are their challenges, and figuring out, how can we support them? How can we, integrate changes through the work that we do that better, addresses the needs of the people of California. And so I just really appreciate those opportunities to build relationships and build connections with community. It's always great. One of the less glamorous roles I've recently transition to a project management level opportunity. And I will say, kind of tracking and reporting on the budget aspects of a project is probably least glamorous for me, just because I guess, I'm not an accountant. And so it's been a bit of a learning curve on kind of tracking budget and reporting on that. And I can't say that type of administrative task is my favorite quality, but I also understand that it's incredibly important for ensuring transparency and accountability and for keeping things on track. So
Absolutely. I do love a spreadsheet, but sometimes, yeah, budget
I like a
can be a
data
lot.
spreadsheet, not a
There's a difference.
financial spreadsheet. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you all for that. Those reflections there. For a final question as we wrap up here, I wanted to ask you all what you might find most motivating about your work or about the mission of the organization as a whole. And yeah, take that as however you want, as a closing, remark here for this panel. So maybe I'll do similar order just to finish out. So maybe Lina, if you want to start.
Yeah, I think I kind of mentioned it a little bit. For me, it feels a little more applied what we do. So it's using research to inform regulations, and that feels a little close to reality. So, and just to touch on that, we are now working on a paper, a manuscript that it just got resubmitted about the 25 years of our program. And with that, we kind of have fresh in our minds the impact of our program throughout the years. And I think it just feels good to be able to look back and see, oh, we have actually done a lot. So it feels pretty good.
Amazing. Thank you. That I'm sure does feel great. Chris.
Yeah, I'll say for the motivating, I guess, is seeing some of the impacts from invasive species firsthand. So I first started diving like 25 years ago or so, and one of my first dives was in Catalina at a place called Bird Rock, and it goes down pretty deep to like 120 feet, and it was pretty glorious. The macrocystis kelp canopy and everything that lived within that. It was a fantastic dive, and it was 20 some years ago, and it's still vivid in my mind. And then a few years ago, I went back to that dive site, and very little macrocystis kelp, a lot of sargassum hornerites, a different algae. It's invasive. It not very tall, so it just this meadow instead of this forest, and the fish diversity and vertebrate diversity was completely different, and it was heartbreaking to see that. And yeah, so knowing what the impacts are and trying to knowing that our team is working to try to prevent those sorts of impacts, and then also just being able to go to the tide pool that I've been going to since I was a kid, and taking my daughters there, and seeing their reactions when they see these really cool things, and trying to ground myself, and like this is what we're doing, right? We're trying to protect these environments, protect these resources so everyone can enjoy them.
Yeah, it's definitely very rewarding. And
Yeah.
Katie, close us out.
Yeah, I'll just say, and I'll keep this brief, but I think one of the incredible things about California is we have public beaches, right? There are places where the, beaches and the coast is privatized, and you can't access that unless you can, pay your way or something. And so this is just an incredible component of, California's management of its lands. And I am really motivated by our mission. We have an incredible responsibility and a challenge. And balancing several what can be competing interests, which are, uh, activities revenue generation, which support, the state's budget. And then we also have, the interest in environmental preservation and conservation, maintaining public access and uses and benefits. And, it's a really difficult, challenge at times to balance these interests and not only consider today's needs but also consider tomorrow's needs, because we're not just managing lands for today and in today's context, but we need to make sure that these lands persist and are stewarded well and protected and conserved for tomorrow as well. And so I just think it's really exciting to work on this challenge, but it is also very difficult, and it's complex and it's dynamic. But I just think it's one of the more motivating factors of this work.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for your time as panelists here, taking the time to chat with us. And those who have tuned in, thank you for your attention and engagement. We're excited to bring this webinar series to you all, and definitely reach out with any feedback. Want to just mention that though not all panels are recorded, this one will be available for future reference on OST's website, which you can find through this QR code or in the chat earlier. There's a lot of resources on there as on top of the recorded panels. Our next webinar is May 7th, 12 to 1 p.m., and we're going to have staff from the California Water Boards, and they'll share their insights. So we're excited to have those folks come on next. If you haven't already, be sure to sign up for those future webinars on that QR code or through the website. And the last thing to mention is if as you go, you will see a quick 3-question survey show up on your Zoom. So please just take a moment to fill that out. We'd love to hear from you and get your feedback. And this will just really help us improve the webinar series. So just take a moment to fill that out. And with that, I look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you so much. Thank you again so much to the panelists.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.